Hello everyone, I am David from Next Generation Automation. In today's class, I will explain the test automation framework architecture for REST API testing using Java, and rest assured, I hope by now you understand the basics of API testing, and how to manual test the API endpoints with different API request types like GET, POST, PUT and DELETE for our Search Hotel API project developed using Spring Boot and REST configuration. API test automation framework architecture divided into multiple blocks. This includes API configuration parameters properties file. API configuration parameters properties file contains parameters like API base URL, environment info whether it's development, testing, user acceptance test or production. Also it contains other important parameters like API authentication type, API proxy enabled flag, API proxy host, API proxy port, API headers, API credential information. Next block of API test automation architecture includes creation of API connection properties class. API connection properties class read data from API configuration parameters properties file and responsible for setting up initial API test configuration that includes define API endpoint, define API headers, define API authentication, check for proxy enable status, define proxy host and proxy port if proxy status set is true. Next block of API test automation architecture includes creation of API utility helper methods class. API utility helper methods class, responsible for providing multiple helper methods that facilitate the testing of multiple API request types. GET, POST, PUT and DELETE. API helper methods enabled to test API with no parameters, test API with either path parameters or query parameters, but no request body, test API with both path parameters and query parameters, but no request body, test API with only request body, and no path parameters and query parameters, test API containing path parameters, query parameters and request body. Also API utility helper methods class provide helper method to generate API request specification from package io.restassured.specification.request specification based on API path parameters, API query parameters and request payload body. Another important helper method provided by API utility helper methods class is API response map. API response map method provides mapping between API response codes with respect to API response generated at time of test execution. Common API response codes supported by framework includes API response body, API response status code, API response content type, API response session ID, API response headers, API response time, API response OAuth access token, API response OAuth refresh token. Once we are done with the development of API configuration parameters properties file, API connection properties class, API utility helper methods class, next step going to be development of API test class containing multiple test methods based on API request types, GET, POST, PUT and DELETE. As part of testing strategy, we need to make sure APIs under test should not contain any test data. Cleanup method will be written first to clean any test data created because of earlier test runs. Following test sequence needs to be maintained. While running API test, first cleanup method execution, second post API test execution, third get API test execution, fourth put API test execution and last delete API test to be executed. Also test engineers need to make sure while they start developing the test methods, POJO classes also need to be developed in parallel. POJO classes hold information about request payload body parameters and response payload body parameters and provide mapping between request and response JSON files located under API test data factory package and API test class methods to be written as part of test development effort. Once all test methods are written to verify API request, GET, POST, PUT and DELETE, it's time for test execution. In the developed framework, test methods will run using test.ngxml files which can be further integrated with Maven Surefire plugin for running API tests from command line or CI/CD DevOps pipeline. With this we have reached the end of today's class. In today's class, I walk you through important components of framework that need to be developed as part of Learn Enterprise Level API Test Automation program. I hope you liked the video and starting next class, we will switch to the development environment. Development effort is going to split between two phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. As part of Phase 1 development, framework is going to be developed, and as part of Phase 2 we will write the test methods for API verification. Get, post, put and delete as part of the Hotel Search API project developed using Spring Boot and REST configuration. Thanks for watching.